Okay, so now we've looked at how stereotyping works, but let's now take some time to look at why people stereotype. So stereotyping is considered to have two main functions. On the one hand, to easily process ambiguous information. So this is a function to enable participants or people. I keep saying participants because I think so much in terms of research, but of course this is about people. So it means to stereotype often means to make comprehension easily possible. And stereotyping does have social functions, however. So it's not only the cognitive function that it might be easier to process information if we rely on stereotypes, but there's also the social dimension that if we derogate others, so stereotypes might leak into our behavior and then we put others down, that might help us feel better about ourselves. So a second function of stereotypes could be that we derive some self-affirmation and we make ourselves feel better when we use stereotypes against others. First, let's take a look at the comprehension function. Let's see how stereotypes can help people process ambiguous information. And here I want to show you a study that goes into why, so processing ambiguous information, the idea is that stereotypes drive inferences about others when category membership is present. And when no other information is available, then men are rated as more aggressive than women. So this is the idea. And participants are asked to rate the aggressiveness of a man and a woman. And the information they get is the following. So they're told that either John or Jane hits a person. If there's nothing else available in this case, then men are rated as more aggressive than women. Okay, but you might stereotypically presume different jobs and therefore think of different behaviors when you only read that John versus Jane hits a person. So then rather than straight up effects of stereotypes on judgment, this would be an indirect effect through which we make sense of the ambiguous information. So maybe John is a construction worker and beats up his colleague, and maybe Jane is a kindergarten teacher and disciplines a child. So we can add some more information to the context, right? So if we then also add information about the other person, we can take a look at how the type of information that is available influences our aggressiveness or aggression judgment, right? So ambiguous information, that's the one that we are particularly interested here, is to say, well, someone annoyed this person and then they got hit. High aggression information would be that the other person insulted our target, John or Jane. And low aggression information would be that, for instance, they discipline a child. Okay, so this study looks at the role of stereotypes where basically we have information about the actor, so there is individuating information available, and we have information about the circumstances. So basically what we can do is we can assess the cognitions that are going on while people stereotype, and what we would expect is that there should be, if we look at general ambiguous behavior, so for instance, hitting the person, someone who annoyed them, then this hitting the person should have a big effect on stereotypical construal. But if we have a more specific type of behavior, so the high or low aggression type, then for instance, disciplining a child, then there should be a smaller effect on stereotypical construal. So in more detail, here is what the participants were actually exposed with. So this is a piece directly from the paper describing the design, and it goes like this. So each subject read one vignette in which either a housewife or a construction worker hit someone. 1/3 of the subjects were given the general ambiguous description that they hit someone who annoyed them, him or her. 1/3 were given high aggressiveness construal of that act that had been generated to describe a construction worker hitting someone. The construction worker's neighbors was taunting him about his marriage, and finally the construction worker lost his temper and decked the neighbor. And in the housewife condition, the actor was said to be a housewife. So that would have been the housewife's neighbor was taunting her about her marriage, and finally the housewife's lost her temper and decked the neighbor. In 1/3, we're given a low aggressiveness control that had been generated to describe a housewife hitting someone. The housewife spanked her 6-year-old son when he trudged mud all over the carpet. She then regretted her action and comforted her son. And in the construction worker condition, the actor was said to be a construction worker, so it would be like the construction worker spanked his 6-year-old son when he trudged mud all over the carpet. He then regretted his action and comforted his son. That is the design. So we have here basically 6 different, 6 different versions of the story. Let's take a look at what our data tells us. So the dependent variable is the aggressiveness rating, right? And we can differentiate between, first of all, the construction worker. This is a bit hard to see, but yeah, you can differentiate the lines from the construction worker, the data from the construction worker setting to the housewife setting, because the housewife data has filled black dots and the construction worker data has lighter gray squares. Okay, so if we compare the ambiguous behavior to the conditions where there was more specific behavior, either high or low aggression behavior that was shown, then what we can see is that between the construction worker and the housewife scenarios, there's actually not much evidence of a difference in the aggressiveness rating given in the high aggression treatment and in the low aggression treatment. So yes, we do see it. People's aggressiveness ratings respond to how aggressive the deed was. Spanking a child was considered to be less aggressive than hitting the taunting neighbor. But the aggression levels were similar for the construction worker and the housewife. Okay. However, in the ambiguous case, that's where we see a big difference between the aggression levels judged for the housewife, much lower, than judged for the construction worker, much higher. So this goes to show us that if information is ambiguous, then people use stereotypes to process it. But if information is actually quite specific, then the kind of social categories and beliefs held about social categories don't play such a big role anymore. Okay. So now you remember that there is a second reason why people might stereotype, and this is to make themselves feel better. So instead of just using stereotypes to make more sense of our environment, people sometimes use stereotypes to make themselves feel better, because based on these stereotypes, they can put others down. You know, here we have a design from a study that looked at how this self-affirmation due to derogation of others based on stereotypes takes place. So this study took place in 2 phases. In the first phase, participants were either in the affirmation or in the no affirmation condition. So in the affirmation condition, participants were asked to write about which value was important to them personally and to explain why. And in the no affirmation condition, they were asked to write about which value was least important to them and to write why this value might be important to someone else. Now, in the second phase, participants were then told that their task was to evaluate an individual who had applied for a job. So they were supposed to evaluate how suitable a candidate was for a job in sales, for a position in sales. And their resume showed that the applicant was basically like an okay applicant, but the difference was that the character who was applying was either supposed to be a Italian person, a person with Italian heritage, or a person with Jewish heritage. So now we need some context information. The stereotype about being Jewish at the time was more negatively stereotyped than being Italian. Okay, and the participants were asked to rate how how good a candidate they thought the Italian or the Jewish person were. So now we can take a look at the data, and here we have the rating of the candidate's personality. So how good a person is the candidate, depending on the self-affirmation conditions, and on whether the candidate was presented as Jewish or Italian. So what we see is on the left, we have the self-affirmation condition. Those are the participants who were writing before about something that was important to them personally, a value that was personally important to them. And you can see there's no evidence that the two bars for the Jewish and the Italian candidate differ. So participants didn't differentiate how good of a person this was, depending on what they'd read about them. And this wasn't conditioned on the nationality presented or the heritage presented. While in the not self-affirmed condition, we do see some stereotyping going on, right? We see that the Jewish candidate is rated to have a lower, less nice, less fitting personality than the Italian candidate. And this is in line with the stereotype at the time. So we see here that participants who didn't self-affirm their values, they did engage in stereotyping. So if you only see that, you could assume that it makes people to feel better to stereotype, right? But for that, it would actually be nice if they had measured self-esteem, right? If they had measured if the people felt good about themselves before the self-affirmation task, then if the people after the self-affirmation task then change to feel better about themselves compared to the not self-affirmed people, and then if stereotyping actually made the not self-affirmed people feel better about themselves, right? So it would have been nice if we had some measure of self-esteem, but it's not in this study. However, it is included in another study by the same authors. So in this follow-up study, participants were asked to take an intelligence test, and then they received some false feedback. So they were either told that their score was positive, it was a good score, or they were given negative feedback and told that, yeah, their score wasn't great. So after their self-esteem was measured, and now we have our self-esteem measure that we were looking for before, right? And after that, they were then asked to rate an Italian or a Jewish applicant on various stereotypical items. Here, the Italian person was the not stereotyped, the Jewish, the actually negatively stereotyped person. And then there was another measurement of self-esteem. So here, the question that can be answered is whether a threatened self-image actually causes participants to derogate a member of the stereotyped group, and then whether this derogation makes them feel better if it then restores self-esteem. Okay, so first of all, we can again take a look at the ratings of the candidate. So this is basically a replication with a different manipulation to the study that we've seen before. So here, participants who got positive feedback, this would be similar to the self-affirmation condition from before. We don't see evidence for a difference in stereotyping the Jewish versus Italian candidate, but participants who received negative feedback, so those would be the ones who didn't feel good about themselves. There we can see some evidence for stereotyping negatively the Jewish candidate. So the Jewish candidate got a less positive rating overall than the Italian candidate by people who received negative feedback. Okay, and now does this actually affect how people feel about themselves? Does stereotyping make people who got negative feedback initially feel better about themselves after they've stereotyped this person? So here what we see is the self-esteem. The increase in self-esteem after actually being given the opportunity to stereotype. So, and we have this split by feedback type again. So for positive feedback, we wouldn't expect that there's any difference in how people felt in terms of their self-esteem between rating the Jewish and the Italian candidate, right? But and that's what we see, but for the negative feedback condition, we can see that people who rated negatively the Jewish candidate, they made themselves feel so much better. Their self-esteem rating is now through the roof. So increase in self-esteem was the highest among participants who received negative feedback and then evaluated the Jewish candidate. Okay, so this would be evidence that indeed stereotyping others makes us feel better.